Hi everyone, welcome to episode 5, the summer edition of Science in a Post-Truth World. So I want to start by taking on a weighty term that we have not much discussed yet, but is inextricable from conceptions of truth: objectivity. I think it useful to start any discussion of a term by running through the way the term is used. So first, there's the noun form. We strive for objectivity. This would denote the quality or state of being objective, which is the adjective form. We say, be more objective, or we apply this as a modifier to other quite weighty words: objective knowledge, objective analysis, objective truth, objective reality. And where there's an adjective, there's an adverb. We can think objectively. So what do these terms actually mean? Well, we can take a step back and look at the root of the word, object. Objectivity presumably has something to do with objects. So is that all these terms mean? Objective knowledge is knowledge about objects? Objectivity is less a property of knowledge and more an orientation towards certain properties, namely the properties of objects? In a similar sense, we could say that biological knowledge denotes knowledge about biology, not knowledge that is living and breathing. And this connotation seems to hold in some sense. When you want to look at something objectively, typically this would mean paying careful attention to the inherent characteristics of that thing, the object. So is objectivity an ontological descriptor rather than an epistemological one? But then why do we come to associate objectivity with truth? Deer's discussion of the ways early modern philosophers employed the concept of objectivity can help shed some light on this question. These philosophers did associate objectivity with truth, or at least certainty, but not in the way that it might be commonly supposed. For them, what kind of knowledge we could obtain about some object was tied to the ontology of that object. In this sense, objective certainty did not reflect the qualities of an inquiry, but the qualities of the object itself. Indeed, we often talk in a way that reflects this. For example, it's commonly supposed that natural sciences are more objective than social sciences. But what is it that makes this the case? Is it that the methods of the natural sciences are radically different than those of the social sciences? Or is it that they explore different objects of inquiry? And you don't even have to look at the objects of the social science to illustrate this. Within the natural sciences, there are some objects that yield relatively unambiguous knowledge, while other objects are much harder to get a grasp on. Understanding the dynamics of a single falling object or an astronomical body is much simpler than understanding the dynamics of a climate system, for example. But what about the classic distinction between subjective and objective? Doesn't this account for the differences in the social and natural sciences? Maybe it sounds strange to talk about the objects of social scientific inquiry. What are those objects? Well, human beings, presumably, and their behaviors. Can you really study the objective properties of human beings? Of course, you could study their physiology, their genetic makeup, and other relatively external properties. But we would probably place those inquiries in the natural sciences. Social sciences, on the other hand, are actively interested in things like perceptions, motivations, attitudes, and even feelings. These are what we might call internal mental states, the subjectivities of people. If we treat these as objective properties, that is to say, part of the inherent ontology of people, then they seem to be properties that are quite difficult to get at. They are unlike a person's hair color or height, or blood type, and so on. They are not something we have relatively direct observational access to. How do you measure another person's feelings or attitudes? This points to another common distinction shaping notions of objectivity: qualitative versus quantitative. Properties that can only be measured or described qualitatively are ontologically different than quantitative properties. But here, we can still talk in the same way as Deer's 17th century philosophers. It is the ontology of the object of inquiry, in this case, human beings and their mental states, that defines how much objectivity is possible. Maybe we can now introduce a term that often goes hand in hand with objectivity: facts. It is common to hear talk of objective facts. Taken in the sense that I've been discussing here, all this would mean is facts about the properties of an object. But of course, facts have an added connotation linked to the other concern of Deer's 17th century philosophers. A fact connotes certainty. Facts are supposed to be clear, unambiguous statements about the world. But what makes them so? In modern uses, certainty and objectivity are often used as synonyms. Certain knowledge and objective knowledge would mean essentially the same thing. For the philosophers Deer discusses, certainty and objectivity are linked, but they're not synonymous. For these philosophers, certainty is defined objectively, pertaining to the ontology of the object itself, and formally, pertaining to the qualities of the inquiry. And this brings us to the other common connotation of subjectivity: the conditions that shape your inquiries. Subjectivity is about making judgments. Going back to the qualitative versus quantitative distinction, we could say something like this: it's the properties of the object that determines whether we can measure or describe it qualitatively or quantitatively. This, in turn, shapes the kinds of judgments that need to take place, with quantitative judgments presumably being easier than qualitative ones. So in this regard, objectivity and subjectivity are not opposites, but they interact with one another. And it is how they interact that determines the degree of certainty that is possible for a given inquiry. A crucial point here is that in this conception, subjectivity is not something that gets in the way of objectivity, but is rather necessary to gain knowledge about an object. And as Blackburn argues, we can't treat the object of inquiry and the methods of inquiry independently of one another. Your inquiry, your judgments, need to be calibrated to the specific thing you are trying to find out about. Here's a question that might help illuminate all of this. Why do we seem to be able to arrive at facts about some things, but not others? In the defense of facts, for example, in the science wars, gravity always seems to make an appearance. Gravity is a fact, and if you doubt it, jump out a window, to paraphrase Alan Sokal. Or more precisely, falling objects on Earth accelerate at a rate of 9.8 meters per second squared, depending on elevation. But this is a fairly simple fact, and easy to measure. In the rubric of 17th century philosophers, the falling object lends itself to objective certainty, physical certainty, and the required inquiry lends itself to formal certainty. And these easy facts typically play an outsized role in rhetoric about science and objectivity, as if because science can provide answers to easy questions, it could somehow give us universal truth. In this regard, I think a reasonable definition of a fact is something that's easy to measure and make judgments about. But the philosophical challenge is whether those easy cases offer any sort of scaling up analogy for the harder cases. And it happens to be the harder cases that we are interested in and seem more pressing and urgent. We can relate this back to the social science versus natural science distinction. Are facts in the social sciences harder to come by than facts in the natural sciences because social scientists are too subjective? One of the central and most long-standing debates within those social sciences is whether or not the methods of the natural sciences are appropriate for studying social phenomenon. The consensus seems to be that they're not. Often this gets framed as a question of rigor. The natural sciences are more precise, more rigorous. But does the precision that's possible come from the methods of inquiry or from the objects of inquiry? Is it simply that the kinds of things that social scientists inquire about cannot be measured with the same precision as the kinds of things that natural scientists inquire about? What these questions undermine is the idea that there is some universal method of inquiry that can be implemented to maximize certainty, or in other words, help us produce facts. But what about the other way around? Can we move from facts to universal knowledge? A common idea of facts is that they are simple, unambiguous empirical statements. They approach obviousness. People routinely argue that facts speak for themselves. Because of this, it is often argued, or at least hoped, that facts can play an axiomatic role in a system of knowledge. In our recent online discussions, we talked about other kinds of axioms, those of mathematics and logic. For dear 17th century philosophers, and many current ones, knowledge of math and logic yielded the highest degree of certainty. The truths of mathematical and logical systems are alluring because they don't require external verification. They are deductive truths. As long as you accept the axioms of that system, you're compelled to accept the conclusion that system yields. Needless to say, the place of math and logic in the history of philosophy is an exalted one. I hate to take things back to Plato, but there's a reason philosophy so often leads back to Plato. And for Plato, our knowledge of geometry was essentially proof of the existence of perfect ideas and forms. The pinnacle of truth, and indeed reality, for Plato was mathematics, specifically geometry. But Plato also argued that access to this reality via our empirical senses was not possible. Our empirical reality was in fact not reality and offered no genuine truths. As Deere notes, philosophers have long distinguished between the kinds of truths that are possible via mathematics and logic and the kinds of truths that are possible via empirical inquiry. But the urge to ground empirical knowledge axiomatically so that we can imagine our truth claims to be as neatly defined and verifiable as the truths of mathematics or logic has been a long-standing philosophical project. Within formal philosophy, such a project has become increasingly met with skepticism. Logical positivism, the last grand attempt at such a project, has very few active adherents. But less formally, the underlying ideal behind a project like logical positivism is quite active. A term for denoting this broader and more general philosophical urge to ground our knowledge in something stable and certain is foundationalism. Now, I think that our beliefs, and whichever those beliefs we deem to be knowledge, do have something like foundations. We hold many of our beliefs with quite a high degree of stability. We don't change our views of the world radically from day to day. What we've been largely talking about in this course is how our worldviews are underlaid by sets of assumptions. The crucial questions are, how essential are those assumptions? Can any of them be said to be fundamental or necessary? Can we narrow our assumptions down to very clear and discrete foundations, or even a singular foundation, like a cornerstone, upon which we base our knowledge? And can we justify any of these assumptions? Which of these assumptions are so certain that everything else that follows them can be also said to be certain? How do we get past simply making assumptions? The go-to strategy in philosophy and elsewhere is to appeal to the notion of self-evidence. Last session we talked about constitutions, in particular in the American context. The second paragraph of an American foundational text starts, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." Now, I don't want to be too flippant about it, but it's hard to think of a more philosophically dubious concept than self-evidence. The claim to self-evidence is just to add a very strong rhetorical insinuation, namely an exhortation that if you don't also find my assumptions to be self-evident, then you are wrong. It dresses up one's assumptions while calling into question others' judgments or values or intuition. There are various other problems with foundationalism. Even if we get past the issue of how to justify our assumptions, it remains a question whether or not knowledge rests on foundations at all. Which is to say, do our beliefs rest upon a metaphorical support structure, as a building does? Is knowledge like a tower, whereby higher and higher forms of knowledge rest on the supports underneath? A prominent alternative metaphor is that knowledge is not like a tower, but like a web. And the strength of that knowledge does not derive from some foundational cornerstone or bedrock, but in the way that web hangs together, with each part of it mutually supporting another. In philosophy, the alternative to foundationalism is typically called coherentism. This view is commonly associated with the philosopher Willard Van Orman Quine, who talked of the web of belief. In this web, no particular belief, whether it be empirical or theoretical or logical, was foundational, but they were all mutually supportive of one another. In the language of STS, they were co-produced or co-constitutive. And what this image of knowledge suggests is not that if you take away foundational assumptions, then the entire edifice of knowledge collapses, but instead, our beliefs, and especially our worldviews, which are vast collections of beliefs, are much more resilient than foundationalism would allow. Examples from science abound. A scientific theory must rest on the evidence. In this regard, the empirical data appears foundational. But scientists never throw out long-standing theories just because they're confronted with recalcitrant data, new observations that the theory can't apparently account for. Maybe the data is problematic. Maybe the experimental apparatuses were not working properly. Maybe there's some explanatory power in the theory that hadn't been previously considered. The point is that all of these things need to be considered in tandem. This isn't to say that, again, our beliefs or theories or worldviews are completely arbitrary, or even that each assumption or belief that constitute our worldviews are all equally important. In a web, there are still components that play more or less important roles in giving it integrity. But what the metaphor highlights is that the web can be damaged and rebuilt without completely dismantling it. And moreover, there is no single component that once removed would make the entire web collapse. Now, these are just metaphors. They are just meant to help us think about the ways our worldviews are constituted. And it might have become apparent to you that we frequently talk about another building metaphor in STS, social construction. I think social construction can be interpreted in both a foundational and coherentist sense. What's critical about the social construction metaphor is that it calls into question why the assumptions that underlie our worldviews are in place. Are they actually self-evident? Do they emerge from some indisputable logic? Or do they come from somewhere else? If we take a coherentist perspective on knowledge, what does the social add to the way that the web is constructed? We talked quite a lot about relativism in the last 2 sessions, and the way it's ostensibly connected to social constructionism, or constructivism, same thing. Critics allege that constructionism leads to radical relativism, or even some fantastical form of idealism, whereby all knowledge is arbitrary. And this fear often leads to a defense of foundationalism. Without some secure and stable foundations of knowledge, then all claims to truth just degrade into a chaotic free-for-all. But this is not what constructionism suggests at all. Indeed, the very metaphor, construction, is to talk about something that has been built up over time and thus has stability. And empirical studies from constructionist perspectives don't show that knowledge is random and arbitrary, but rather resilient and predictable. The question is, why? Certainly, constructionism does undermine notions of universality or timelessness, and in this sense, it is relativistic. But within specific context of space and time, the assumptions that shape people's worldviews are durable and indeed resistant to change. That's what makes deconstructing beliefs so difficult in the first place. What constructionism reveals is that the idea that we have to choose between timeless universals or utter arbitrariness and randomness is a false dichotomy. Instead, what constructionism forces us to do is look at the contexts of knowledge. And context can only be understood by the defining of scale and scope. Concerns with context is not just something that emerges out of the social sciences. Natural scientists also have to define the scale and scope of their analyses. The idea that natural scientists are always operating with universals is clearly not the case. Scientists deal with particular phenomena, subatomic particles, an organism, local ecosystems, the Earth's climate system, the solar system, which all define specific scales of the universe. The equations of quantum mechanics, for example, do not have universal applicability to every question pertaining to the natural world. It's applicable to a specific scale of matter, and more crucially, to the scope of the questions you are asking. A question has come up both in our class discussions and in the broader discussions about post-truth. Do facts matter? Or perhaps, why don't facts matter anymore? For example, much ado has been made about Donald Trump's former campaign manager Kellyanne Conway's remark about quote-unquote alternative facts. I think this comment can be read in 4 ways. First, in the way in which it's been criticized, which is the idea that 2 people can operate with completely conflicting data sets, ostensibly measuring or describing the same phenomena. Critics argue that if 2 people try to measure something different and get different measurements, they clearly can't both be valid. Thus, the idea of alternative facts seems absurd. And since the measurement in question that prompted the remarks was the number of people at Trump's inauguration rally, her comments do seem a bit absurd. But for all of the worry, that these comments provoked, it should be said that conflicts about basic measurements are rarely the root cause of serious knowledge disputes. Even the most stubborn skeptics typically come around to accepting unambiguous data. But while the images comparing Trump's inauguration rally to Obama's seem to pretty unambiguously show that Obama's had a much higher attendance, data is not always unambiguous. This is the second, more generous sense that we might understand this phrase. While it is often supposed that data is a given and a theory results from the interpretation of that data, data itself is the result of interpretation. Indeed, scientists frequently try to measure the same phenomenon and get different results. They then have to make an interpretation of why that's the case. Perhaps the measurement apparatus failed. Perhaps the sampling method was poorly designed. Perhaps the way the measurements were reconstructed into a usable data set was faulty. So if facts are just data, then scientists argue about alternative facts all the time. To talk about interpretation brings us to the third sense of alternative facts. Are facts just data? Or are facts the explanations of that data? I frequently heard the phrase, climate change is a fact. I've also heard the phrase, climate change is just a theory. So which is it? Climate change is indeed a complex theoretical explanation that accounts for immense sets of diverse data. By what means has it attained the status of fact? At the very least, this would involve the interpretation that this theory is extremely well supported, so much so that we can reasonably exclude alternate explanations. Even if we accept that theories can become facts, we must concede that the facts don't speak for themselves. They must be interpreted. Finally, the fourth and most significant way we can understand the idea of alternative facts is in the sense offered by Jasanoff and Simmet. When and why do certain facts matter? I've talked about how values guide fact-finding. Another way of thinking about this is that we measure what we care about. What this means is that if we care about different things, we will measure different things. And as a result, we will operate with different data sets that show us different aspects of the world. Cities have a lot of data on automobile traffic. They have far less on pedestrian behaviors or the patterns of cyclists. Thus, policy-wise, it is much easier to justify decisions about the former than the latter. In our COVID context, we have been bombarded with all kinds of data. The main graphical presentation that we see of this data shows the number of daily new cases, not total cases. This is because this is the figure that policymakers deem to be the most relevant to deciding what kinds of restrictions are required. We can also variously measure fatality rate per confirmed cases, or fatality rate per capita, or recovery rates, and so on. Each of these signifies a different concern and different way of framing and viewing the problem. And if we have different concerns, we measure different things, and thus in a very real sense, we operate with sets of alternative facts. So to echo Jasanoff and Simmet, post-truth is less about whether or not the facts matter and more about which facts matter. Beyond the dry philosophy of Deer's historical exposition of objectivity, I think this is a key takeaway lesson. Objectivity and facts, and objective facts, despite their rhetorical power, are not terms that can be easily defined. Not only might we operate with alternative facts, we might have alternative ideas of what actually constitutes a fact. And the rhetorical power is precisely why we need to be reflexive and careful with these terms. While people want to readily appropriate the language of objectivity and appeal to conceptions of scientific facts, these have very little to do with the ways that people actually go about forming their views of the world. The number of beliefs that most people hold, at least about things that are non-mundane, like where they live or where they park their car or locked up their bike, that can be said to meet the standards of objectivity or facts, even by one's own standards, are probably very few. So there's a question. Has post-truth prompted greater care with talk of facts? Or has it instead increased the rhetoric?